Hello, everyone. Welcome. While you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to know where our audience is and what compelled you to check this out today. What are you familiar with our authors or our moderator? Are you really interested in? Well, you must be interested if you're tuning into the webinar. So just yeah, please let us know where you're coming from and what drew you to the webinar. Just while we wait for people to arrive, we're almost um, at our point here. And I guess I'll just go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo. I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm delighted to host tonight's program, Radical Lives for Abolitionists. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. We would also like to thank the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. Their extraordinary collection documents the centuries of the artistic, literary, military, enslaved, and free life of Blacks in America. In addition to the care and development of their collection, the center preserves and interprets African American culture and history and corrects the misrepresentation and underrepresentation of this important aspect of our country's evolution. Now let me introduce our guests. We are welcoming Drs. Linda Hirshman and Lydia Moland for a discussion with Dr. Dan J. Broyld about their books. Our first author is Linda Hirshman, a retired labor lawyer and professor. She specializes in revolutionary social movements. Her new book, The Color of Abolition: How a Printer, a Prophet, and a Contessa Moved a Nation, explores the friendship and subsequent rift of formerly enslaved orator Frederick Douglass, journalist William Lloyd Garrison, and Maria Weston Chapman, known as the Contessa, who raised money and managed Douglass's speaking tour from her Boston townhouse. Our second author is Lydia Moland. She is a professor of philosophy at Colby College. Her new book, Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life, documents the life of the beloved and self-sufficient female 19th century author. She became famous for her self-help books and children's stories, but shocked her readers by publishing the first book-length argument against slavery in the United States, which drew untold numbers to the abolitionist cause. Our moderator is Dan J. Broyld. He is an associate professor of African American history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. His work focuses on the American-Canadian borderlands and issues of Black identity, migration, and transnational relations, as well as oral history, material culture, and museum community interactions. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. Both the live transcript and the Q&A section are at the bottom center of the screen. So that is enough from me. Please sit back and enjoy, and I'm going to turn it over to Linda, Lydia, and Dan. And it's just going to take me 1 second to get them on the screen. So please bear with us.
All right, cheers. I hope everyone's doing well this evening. I'm glad everybody's here to join us to talk about four important abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Lydia Maria Child, and Maria Chapman are the individuals that we will be discussing tonight on these two very important books. I'm just waiting to see if Lydia's here.
I'm here, but I'm unable to unmute my video. I think Omar may need to do that for me.
Okay, Omar, I'm just gonna wait on you. I definitely want to see. Oh, there
we go.
Okay, great. We're all here.
Very good.
All right, I wanted to see everyone. All right, so cool. To kind of start out our question, I just wanted to ask you, how did you both come to write your current books? Perhaps I can start with Linda and move on to Lydia.
So I did my work in graduate school on the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. So I've always been interested in how people act collectively to accomplish various social, in his case, of course, it was the founding of the government, against the forces that pull them apart. And of all of the social movements that I studied, abolition is the most successful one. I've always wanted to write a book about abolition, the most successful social movement in American history. So after a book or two ago, time is passing. I think it's time for me to write about abolition. And it seemed to me that, there's been a lot written about it. But I was particularly interested in how Black people and white people could act collectively across the racial divide to accomplish that astonishing social end. And then as I was doing my work, it was going to tell me about Lloyd Garrison, the publisher, and Frederick Douglass, the great orator and writer. But as I was doing it, I stumbled across Maria Weston Chapman. So it got to be a book about how people act together across genders as well.
Yes, and I'm also a trained philosopher. So Linda and I have that in common. We started in philosophy and have moved to biography. I had written a couple of books about German philosophy and spent most of my career very happily exploring that very interesting part of philosophy's history. But especially after the 2016 election, I just had the feeling that I wanted to come home to my own country and think more about how moral questions operated in my own history. And I wanted to turn to women. So I had an incredible stroke of good fortune in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe at Harvard. I was looking through a box of letters and discovered one by Lydia Maria Child. I had never heard of her before, but what she had written just electrified me. She was clearly someone who had thought very hard about how to address a moral emergency in her country and had thought very hard about pursuing racial justice, not just in the form of eliminating slavery, but much beyond that as well. So once I discovered her, I think my life has really never been the same.
Yeah. Lydia, were you also drawn to her first name? I thought that was so ironic. I was like,
well, here's the real irony. She didn't like her name.
Right,
so
right.
I try not to take that personally, but she disliked it so much that she chose a new middle name, which she pronounced Mariah, and insisted that people call her Mariah. And so she always signed her names L. Maria Child. So the first letter of hers that I saw, I didn't even know her first name was Lydia because she didn't want to use it.
Cool. Yeah, I thought that was the great thing about this conversation is that it involves, multicultural and it's balanced, if you will, along gender lines. I thought that was just a great kind of way to approach, an equitable way to approach abolition. And so I want to move on to another question and ask you guys both, how can you kind of both sum up your main thesis, and can you provide 2 or 3 main themes in which your book addresses? So your main thesis and 2 or 3 main themes that your book addresses.
I would say that the characters in my book cooperated across racial and gender lines, and they acted collectively and were enormously empowered by their ability to act together until they couldn't. So there was a deep outline in the abolitionist movement all along. And it was just a matter of time until it emerged. Even the abolitionists, even the white abolitionists, even the abolitionists were deeply racist in their assumptions about human value, even when they were sacrificing their lives to end slavery. So it was just a question of time till Frederick Douglass, who did not suffer full gladly, figured out that they were treating him as lesser and resistant. But it's a book because they helped Frederick Douglass out, and when he left the Boston of abolition, he went to New York abolition, who had the right idea about what needed to be done next anyway. So it was really a blessed.
Yes, I think try to think of a thesis of the book. It has something to do with trying to learn from the ways in which someone like Lydia Maria Child could use her many talents to fight an entrenched evil, but also stretch herself into modes of engagement that she never could have imagined. And also in my biography anyway, I'm very open that I'm trying to learn from her example about my own moral life. I think as someone who teaches moral philosophy, that's something that I bring to her life that hadn't been in the previous wonderful biographies that had been written about her. And I really try to explore ways in which her status as a white woman got in the way of her activism, even when she had absolutely the best intentions. So again, exactly as Linda said, she was someone who suffered real privation and ostracism, lost friends, lost income, etc., in the quest to end enslavement, and again, to fight for racial justice. So that was not limited to ending enslavement, but that didn't mean that she didn't embrace a real kind of respectability politics, insofar as she continued to believe that, and to say to Black Americans that if they would just dress nicely and talk softly and act as European as possible, white Americans would lose their prejudice and everything would be okay. She knew on some level that that wasn't true, because often it was Black Americans who succeeded in those ways and built businesses and got educations that enraged white Americans most. But she did try to at least convince her fellow white Americans to accept Black Americans if they behaved in certain ways. And so I use the book to try to think that through quite a bit in my own life too, and just to try to learn from that the kinds of limitations that someone like me can bring even to racial justice work.
Yeah, and that's what I really appreciate about both of your books, is how you guys problematize the abolitionists and really kind of, call them on their own racial biases and things of that nature. The one thing that's really important to understand about abolitionists, and particularly these 4 abolitionists, is that they all kind of traveled in the same circles, right? And the overlay of just knowing each other was, they all kind of knew each other because the circle of abolitionists were so small. I'm thinking about the abolitionists made up, less than 1% of the Northern population. We tend to think with all the books that are written on abolitionists that we can just shoot a rock up in the North and hit an abolitionist. But it's not so. And so that's why the lines of these 4 people are kind of overlapping, and they're interacting with some of the same individuals, which is really kind of neat, but also daunting in that there's so few of them. I wanted to ask you guys also, what primary resources and archives did you both use to write and research your books? And I can start with Lydia this time. And
Okay.
Linda, how about that?
Yes. So Child's archives are not collected anywhere singular. So they're spread around in several different places, including at Cornell. The Boston Athenaeum has some, the Massachusetts Historical Society has some. And so I did go to those places and, look at as many, and also the New York Historical Society, and looked at as many original pieces as I could. Her correspondence was collected in the 1980s, I think, onto microfiche. And so I spent weeks and weeks and weeks at the Boston Athenaeum, fitting those little bizarre things into those, antiquated machines, and saving those letters. So that was one of the challenges of the research that I was doing. But what Cornell has is really moving, some of the things that she wrote about her husband after his death, for instance, and some unpublished things that she that were left in her correspondence afterwards.
So big shout out to the Boston Public Library. The Boston Public Library has the Weston Chapman correspondence. They put it online. It is available online, and the library was closed when I was working on my book. First kind of renovation project, wouldn't you know it? And secondly, from the pandemic. So people were just asking me a lot how I have so many books, and that is life, so it's not hard. But in this case, it was the pandemic. I was absolutely trapped, and I could spend all day reading online the full reproductions of the handwritten letters, the Boston clique, the Quinn and all the Boston clique people, and Maria Weston Chapman and her sisters, are all available in full text in their holographic form online from the Boston Public Library. So I was unbelievably lucky to have that. Frederick Douglass's letters and writings are heavily collected in published volumes that I just bought, and Garrison's. And the copy of the Liberator available text online and fully searchable. So it was really great. I will say this. What do you have so far with this? Why you put up one of the impenetrable, illegible handwritten letters on your screen? You find that the people turn the 90-degree angle and they read more at 90 degrees to the original text in order to save postage, it turned out. But if every time you see one of those letters come up, you want to shoot yourself, because right, that you're going to go blind, sitting there at your computer, making it bigger, making it smaller, trying to see what they were saying. Some of the letters were pretty shocking in the way that the Boston abolitionists talked about both Douglass and Remond, who was his fellow lecturer on the lecture circuit. They're great lecturers. They spoke the letters up and saw what they had actually said. I called David Blight. I was like, why didn't you talk about this in your book? Because it is shocking, in my opinion. It was just shocking. But it came to me, poring over the letters. The book could not possibly have written if I had not had it online. It was great.
All right.
Lydia, I thought of something for you. Knowing I was going to see you today, I found the funniest thing to share with you. Law of archival research. You'll find out about the most important document for your research in the last 15 minutes before the archive closes on the last day of your.
Amazing. Very good.
Linda,
in those archives all those
Yes.
years.
Linda, I wanted to ask you, why was the Second Great Awakening so important to the predominantly white Garrisonian anti-slavery movement? You spend a lot of time in the early stages of your book talking about the Second Great Awakening.
So as an historian of social movements, I am keenly aware of the real reality of revelation-based religions in social movements, especially which is my specialty, right? I write about it, study about it. So in Western culture, Judaism with the Exodus story and Christianity with the basic idea that all people are made in the image of God and have souls of value plays an unbelievably important role in all of the movements that I have written about. And including the racial civil rights movement of the 20th century, which was heavily embedded in the black churches. And then from the racial civil rights movement came the feminist movement. So there's a through line of in all the movements. More so, unless you count the Protestant Reformation as a social movement, which I do, than in Abolition. Because I think slavery was, for the Quakers, really, slavery was taken for granted in America in the 18th century. It's just taken for granted. It was assumed it was a nectar of human relationships. And to challenge it morally, this is where and my philosophical is so relevant. Challenge it, you need to purchase outside of the material world that you're challenging. And the Second Awakening said that you have an obligation to make the world a better place. It isn't enough that you happen to be one of those in Calvinism that happen to pick arbitrarily. The change to the Second Great Awakening was this idea of, in Judaism, it's called tikkun olam, to heal the world. And that really comes, well, of course, if you think you have a moral obligation to make the world a better place, slavery becomes ultimately indigestible.
I wanted to ask you, Lydia. Lydia Maria Child, she wrote so many great pieces. I mean, I'm looking at some of her work, The Duty of Disobedience of the Fugitive Slave Act, some of the poems that she wrote, the foreword that she wrote to Harriet Jacobs' book, Over the River and Through the Woods, the poem. I mean, she's written so many different styles and so many pieces of literature, things on Native Americans and stuff like that. Is there any one piece of literature that really spoke to you that she wrote? Because I'm just looking at all of this and I'm like, how did she do this? Even too with her personal life. I'm like, what in the world? Like, I feel like I'm underachieving.
Yeah.
So is there any one or two pieces that just like you read and you were like, okay, this is the one?
Yeah, well, the one for me is the appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans, which she wrote in 1833. That's so early. And she had converted to abolitionism in 1830 and spent those years then just researching and writing this book. And someone that I know taught it recently in a course on the history of Boston, and he reported that students were still shocked at how little they knew about what the facts on the ground about slavery were, which is not that surprising, but it is shocking. And so there's a chapter on economics, there's a chapter on history, there's a chapter on politics, there are chapters on Africans themselves, where she talks about African political leaders and scientists and artists and authors. And it's as if she's just it's a fire hose of denunciation of the bad arguments that white Northerners were using to give themselves permission to ignore the facts about enslavement. And then, as I always say, the last chapter is directed at Northerners. And its first sentence is something like, while we articulate our earnest disapprobation of our brethren in the South. Let us not flatter ourselves that we are any better than they. And then she talks about Northerners' fortunes made on the slave trade and about Northern politicians compromising about slavery. And then she talks about Northern racism. And she says, you know, I see white parishioners not allowing Black parishioners in churches. I see them driving Black Americans out of stagecoaches and out of hotels and out of schools. And she says that Southern slavery can only exist because of Northern racism. And this is why she was ostracized, right? White Northerners did not want to hear that. She was a famous social author. She was a self-help author. She'd written a cookbook, right? People were not interested in getting accused of being complicit in slavery by this person that they trusted. But that kind of combination of clearing the ground of bad arguments and then calling people to a responsibility that they're not willing to think about otherwise characterizes so much of her best work. And I won't talk about it, but you mentioned the duty of disobedience to the Fugitive Slave Act. That is another powerful piece in which she asks Massachusetts senators to imagine that they are enslaved and how they would feel if they managed to escape, ended up in Massachusetts, and were sent back.
Right. It's so interesting that her appeal came within 2 years of each other, and that William Lloyd Garrison saw both of them and was inspired by David Walker to start the Liberal newspaper, which I date as starting a modern abolition. And then saw her right away. He knew immediately that David Child and Child's wife, the most successful, were on his side. And I think, just to circle back to your question about the Second Great Awakening, that the Great Awakening field, and that David Walker's appeal and Lydia Maria Child's appeal, and then the Liberator, were the seeds.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to remember that Garrison started the Liberator where he did because there was a Black abolitionist foundation in Boston. So David Walker and Maria Stewart and the Paul family and Lewis Hayden, all of these people who supported Garrison as he started the Liberator, who published arguments in it that people like Child learned from, and that set an example, really.
Yeah.
And say that Garrison was the least racist of all the abolitionists. He was, he was not at fault in that arena, but I the least racist. His breach with Douglass was more about his arrogant, egomaniacal commitment to his own idea about what one should do than the latent racism found in other people.
So I do kind of take issue with a couple of things that were said, particularly Linda, you mentioned that the Quakers were the first committed abolitionists. And sometimes, people always kind of attribute, white people to the abolitionist movement when, like the argument of Blacks is like, the first person that was grabbed in Africa was an abolitionist, right? So the abolitionist movement was a thing even before it was kind of named. It's kind of like there's gravity before Newton, right? And there's economic determinism before Karl Marx, right? And so to us, to Black people, we're saying into the movement of white people comes so later. It comes in the 1830s. Black people are already advocating for their own freedom, right? When these kind of formalized, organizations are established in the United States. Can you guys speak to that?
Well, you asked me about the role of revealed religion. Okay, so in the universe of white Christianity, the Quakers were the earliest ones, and they were well before 1830. That of course, absolutely right. The fugitive slave narratives date back well before 1830, and there's a robust movement north to try and get prohibit free land from coming and settling there, and So I'm actually just responding to your question about the role of Western religion. Of course, I mean, one of the things I learned reading all those fugitive slave narratives, other than the ones by Douglass that everybody reads, is that they often start with an Edenic scene in Africa, where the writer, and move to start by portraying a life before slavery. And it's incredibly important to recognize that, of course.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that it's so important to remember, Dan, exactly the way you said that, and not only to realize that when we call something a movement, it's often certain people defining it in a way that doesn't correlate to its origins. And then one of the heartbreaking things that I think both Linda and I document is how many times the Black community had to try to say to white abolitionists, no, that's not the direction we want to go in. That's not the way we think it should go. And how often white abolitionists were too quick to say, no, we know what we're doing here. Please just like show up and give a speech like we tell you to, and we'll handle the rest. And Peter Paul Simmons gave this incredible address in New York. I think it was in the 1840s, that was just scathing on this point. He was a Black abolitionist, essentially saying that white abolitionists were setting the cause of Black abolition backwards because they continued to treat Black abolitionists like they didn't know what they needed. And of course, that comes up in such a painful way in Garrison's interactions with Douglass later on. So yeah, I think that it's really important to remember to phrase it that way.
And Douglass, I mean, I said that Garrison's brief Douglass was a result of his egomaniacal idea that he alone could fix it, right? That he actually was wrong about what to be done. Douglass's migration from moral abolition to political abolition in the 1840s was exactly what needed to be done, and the mainstream of Black abolitionists at that point knew that that was the way that the next step had to go. So yes, at the end, Garrison's idea, his own record, was more important even than solving the problem.
Yeah, Lydia, I wanted to ask you, who was John Hopper to Child, and what was her relationship like with her husband, David Lee Child, like?
Yeah, this was a very complicated part of her life. So her husband, David Lee Child, was a wonderful human being. He was very progressive. She often said he was wide awake before she was, both on racial and gender issues. But he was also, I think I say in the book, a walking financial disaster. He was an idealist in everything he did, but he failed at everything he tried. From running a journal to being a lawyer to farming sugar beets in an attempt to undermine the cane sugar plantation trade. So when Child moved, in part because of Maria Weston Chapman, to New York to edit the National Anti-Slavery Standard, she left her husband behind, still in his beet fields, to try to make money to fund that scheme of his, which again, it was a very admirable scheme to try to undermine the economics of slavery. But while she was in New York, she was living with a man named Isaac Hopper, who was a Quaker abolitionist, very famous for his work on the Underground Railroad. And he had a son who was 13 years younger than Child, but with whom she had an incredibly intense platonic relationship, but it was love, and it was complicated for them both. And it was a joy to her as long as it lasted, and a real sorrow to her when it ended. And she essentially fled New York when he finally married. And this was a really interesting part of her life for me to write about, because it almost sounds like a punchline to a joke. You know, here she is, this middle-aged woman, and she has this very passionate friendship with a much younger man who clearly adores her. But I really think it was a beautiful and, again, very unconventional thing that served a spiritual need for them both at a certain point in their lives. Because it was unconventional, it caused both of them quite a bit of pain, but it was a really important part of both of their lives.
Yeah, this was really kind of the high point of your book for me, was chapter 9, First Duties First and How to Do Your Second Duties Too. You come across a letter of Lydia, and she's talking about her husband, and she says he was the most loving husband God ever bestowed upon a woman. And I love your response to it. You say, like, when you read it in the archives at Cornell University, you were skeptical and you almost like roll your eyes. If not, you did roll your eyes. Can you tell us about, because that just made me laugh. I was like, what in the world? Because I was saying the whole time, I'm like, this guy is going to kind of set her writing back. But in a sense, he doesn't, because she writes so much. She's able to kind of work through all of that rigmarole, you know, taking care of him. He's sick sometimes. She brings him down to New York. And it's just amazing the way she's able to do that. So can you speak more to that?
Yeah, it is a moment when I read that in the archives, and I do think I rolled my eyes, I'm afraid, because she wrote that after he died, and he had clearly been such a weight on her much of her life. And as I say, they separated for almost 10 years. Also very unconventional. After he went bankrupt, she had a rupture with some friends, etc. But so I just assumed once they moved back in together and he promised never to spend any money without consulting her first, I thought people never change that way. Like, there was no way we weren't going to see the exact same problems reassert themselves. But in the end, I think she was right. He really decided that he had to stop torturing her in those ways. He essentially just pottered around in his garden, didn't like do any damage, didn't get them into debt anymore. And she often said that their last decades were their best decades. All of the letters that she writes about them and between each other seem to bear that out. And he died in her arms, and she missed him terribly. So it's a fascinating portrait of an unconventional marriage that had a very desperately rocky patch, but resolved in a way that is really quite moving.
Okay. Also, Linda, I wanted to ask you, one of my favorite chapters of yours was chapter 19, Frederick Douglass, international superstar and publisher. Can you just highlight what happens in that chapter?
I love that story, right? He, after his enslavers taught him a little bit about how to read when he was a kid, like 7 or 9. The husband of the couple that where he was living came in and found the wife teaching him how to read and said, "You may not teach a slave how to read. The next thing you know, he's going to run away." And Frederick Douglass heard it and was like, "That seems like a good plan." So he pursued it, and he would look at the symbols of language on the books and stuff, and figure out what they must mean, and then reverse engineer this. That he taught himself how to read, and he would take food from his owner's house and offer it to poor white boys on the docks who knew how to read. "I will give you bread and you will teach me how to read." So when you think about that beginning, it seems that when he write a book, his book would be sensational success, because letters were his weapons and words were his weapons. The greatest speaker, he was, in my opinion, the most important man of the 19th century, full stop, but he was certainly the most important speaker of the 19th century. So when he turned to write memoir, his first one, It was a brilliant and incredibly successful book, and he sold many, and in it he named the people in Maryland who had helped him in slavery. And so they were afraid that the Alds from Maryland come and send slave catchers and return them to slavery. So he published a book. He had to flee from the north to England, where it was safe, where England was free soil, so to speak. Couldn't send enslaved after him to bring him back from England. So he gets to England, and this unbelievable gift for rhetoric and oratory raised him immediately to be like a superstar. It was truly a superstar. Like when the Beatles came to America, that's like when Frederick Douglass went to England, and he attracted everybody, the prime ministers, the mayor, and wanted him to come into their houses. This is a man who couldn't get way to travel in steerage when he traveled in the United States. So he became a star. The rich abolitionists, many Quakers in England took him up, and eventually they raised a fund so that he could come back to the United States and not constantly be afraid that every time he went out on the road, someone would jump from behind a tree and capture him and send him back to slaves. Isn't that a beautiful story? As a writer, that story spoke to me so powerfully.
I mean, that's the great thing about Frederick Douglass. I mean, he's a self-taught scholar, and I think that we need, kind of more of that kind of unschooled, if you will, knowledge. I mean, I always tell my students that I'm a PhD, and sometimes I have to get the thesaurus to find out what Frederick Douglass is saying, right? I mean, this guy is brilliant. We think about these kind of self-taught scholars like, a Malcolm X or a James Baldwin or a Benjamin Franklin or a Miles Davis. I mean, these are like self-taught scholars, right? Which is like they're unschooled, right? And some of that unschooling, I think, actually helps propel them forward, right? So which is just very interesting. I wanted to ask you too, Linda, because I talked about who was Lydia and David Lee, who is Julia Griffins to Frederick Douglass?
Oh, gosh. Well, she was a shocking British abolitionist in Lowell. Daughter of a sort of a ne'er-do-well, but a stationer, and therefore in the word business. And she met him at a party, and she completely looked over him, and she and her sister came to America to help him. They corresponded, lessons all corresponded, so I'll find this. And when Frederick came back to America, and he broke with the Boston, his own newspaper, the North Star was struggling, and Julia Griffith, who was clearly in love with Frederick, married to had actually rescued, helped escape from slavery, so he was like not available. They came to Rochester, where he was living, and they helped George especially to put newspaper into the black, but it was a huge scandal. Imagine a black man and a white woman going everywhere. They were constantly being attacked. They went places together, physically attacked. And the gossip about them is in all the letters. They were heavily gossiped about. Finally, pressure from the white abolitionists pushed Julia to leave him and go back to America. But there's no question that in love with him, and who could possibly resist him? He was so gorgeous and so charismatic.
Speaking of which, I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that Childs basically had a lifelong aversion to photography. When we know that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person in the 19th century, the argument has been made. Please explain the reasons for these approaches to the camera. I'll start with Lydia and then go to Linda.
What a great question. Well, I think Child had a real sensitivity to not wanting to be lionized, was the word that she used. I think she did see some real danger in white abolitionists taking the spotlight too much and becoming, literally the face of a movement. So when she died, for instance, she left just brutally Spartan instructions for her funeral. She didn't even want flowers. She didn't want people, representing various organizations or anything. She just wanted friends and something very simple. And I think that was true for most of her life. That with all of her ferocity in her writing, she wanted her words to be what people remembered and not so much her image or like who she was. And I also think she's pretty honest in a couple of cases about feeling like the older she got, the less she liked the way she looked and the less she wanted her image on things. Although she did at one point, when somebody published a set of portraits that they called representative women of the leaders of many of the movements in the 19th century, they put her in it, an image of her in it, and she wrote right away to say that she was older than that now, and she didn't care who knew it. So I think she had a sort of complicated relationship to her image being used for those reasons.
Yeah, and you have one picture in the book of her, and where did that picture come about? Like, because before it was just kind of these silhouettes of her, and then I guess later in life she got photographed. Or
yep, there were a couple of sittings that people talked her into doing. So there's a very nice one of her reading, and then there's a very funny one that I won't tell the whole story of now, but that has her in a slightly risque off the shoulder shawl, which she later said her husband asked to have taken of her, which again is a kind of lovely testament to their lifelong love for each other. But there's a funny story about that photo getting out in a way that I don't think she intended.
And Linda, can you tell us about Frederick Douglass and photography and
I want to say Maria Weston Chapman was also of that mindset. I think this has to do with a 19th century woman. She gave one speech, they mobbed the meeting, and she never spoke again. She was enormously powerful and very clear about importance. She was also hiring in that way that you just described. So I want to note that. I think that's very interesting. And there are very, very few pictures of her as well. To think about the Frederick Douglass photography, the concept of the invention of the steam printing press, the abolitionist movement, a miracle, led forward in part on media tech. And one of them was the steam printing press and the invention of based paper. And the other was the invention of photography. And Frederick Douglass, with his uncanny ability to see where the line of power lay, understood the power of imagery and took full advantage of it. So his relationship to photography is very Lloyd Garrison's relationship to the invention of steam printing, and it was absolutely essential for the movement to succeed.
Yeah, I think it's important too that, Frederick Douglass spends a lot of time in Rochester, New York. Rochester becomes the image city, the head of Kodak camera. And so he was right there at the roots of that. He understood the power of photography. I personally am from Rochester, New York. I was actually born on South Avenue, not too far from Frederick Douglass's home. And so, I just kind of know he knew the power of photography because he had been in Rochester in and around the advents of companies like Bosch Alarm that was, messing around with lenses and stuff like that in Rochester. So he definitely knew the power of photography. There's no question about that.
The power of fashion. I mean, if you look at the pictures, he is always so gorgeously dressed, so imposing, and even was completely wrong and inappropriate of the abolitionists to demand that their Black members behave in a respectful way. I I like to think that Douglass knew exactly how he was manipulating that narrative.
Interesting.
So I wanted to ask you guys about an individual that makes an appearance in both of your books, and that's Angelina Grimke. And just please allow the audience to know who she is and explain how and why she makes a cameo in each of your books. I like to popularize names that people don't really know in the abolitionist movement. And so Grimke, if you will, Angelina.
Lydia?
Yeah, well, I'll just say right away that everyone should know that there's a fabulous new family biography of the Grimkes that just came out by Carrie Greenidge. It's amazing. It is so important. It is such a vexed American story. And it really follows these two women who were born in South Carolina, owned enslaved people, repented of that, joined the abolitionist movement, became among its most successful speakers, and then later withdrew from the movement and got involved in other ways. But they were allies of both Chapman, Weston Chapman and Child, for sure.
So Angelina Hughes is in part responsible for the split in the abolitionist movement between the Boston and the New York, because she was such a successful speaker that they would stay out of her lectures. And the clergymen who were the backbone of the New York abolitionist movement did not want them lecturing to company. They thought that women ought not to speak in church and women ought not to speak at all. And they leaned heavily on the abolitionists to stop Angelina Grimke from speaking. And when Garrison, to his credit, refused to do that, that was one of the most important causes that split the movement in half. So she's really the unwitting. And one of my characters, Maria Weston Chapman, was really a pretty good stand to organize Angelina Grimke's lecture tours in clear defiance of the clergy trying to shut her up.
So I also, as we kind of end our conversation here, I wanted to ask you guys both how you brought the points of your book together in your epilogues.
Yeah, I think I try to end my book really asking myself to think about what it is that still needs to happen, and in what ways reading these people and studying them calls us to act differently ourselves. And if I could just say briefly what comes to my mind when we think about tomorrow being the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery is that slavery has not been completely abolished in this country. It is still legal as punishment for a crime. And when I think about the kinds of moral emergencies that Child probably would have noticed if she were alive today, and that I'm resolved to be more aware of, the mass incarceration system is absolutely at the top of the list. So if you think about the origins of our current incarceration system, many of them are in slavery. If you think about the things that incarceration is supposed to accomplish, whether it's reforming criminals or keeping communities safe, or justly punishing a crime, essentially none of those things are succeeding. And then if you look at the statistics about the racial and gender and the makeup, the number of people who are incarcerated who have mental illnesses or addiction disorders, it's clear that there is an atrocity going on in this country, and it is something that we don't pay enough attention to. So I end my book not so much with that particular example, but with the question of what do I want to do next in recognition of the kinds of things I think Child would devote her life to now.
And I think I had my eye on the here and now as well. So interesting to hear you say, Lydia, because I delivered my book 1 month after the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. And I felt so powerfully the tragedy of America at the very moment that I was finishing this book. And I wanted to have an epilogue that would give people some hope that even Douglass, who had doubts about Abraham Lincoln, and rightfully so, and upon him, when he went the third time, Lincoln was saying to him, "I'm going to lose when he went the second time, like saying to him, I'm gonna lose the election, gotta let people south as you before that happens. So I wanted people to see the tragedy and yet the necessity to continue in my epilogue. So I made the 3 visits to Abraham Lincoln to try to carry that forward. It looks terrible and dark. You have to keep fighting. And of course, Lincoln won the election. And then, of course, he was assassinated.
All right. I want to turn things back over to Omar for general questions from the audience. Thank you both, Lydia and Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So we only have a few minutes left, but we can at least answer a couple questions. Lisa is asking if Lydia Maria Child had any connections with John Brown.
Oh, and how? Oh, one of my favorite chapters in the book is how involved she got in the aftermath of John Brown's raid. And so I won't tell the story here since we don't have a lot of time, except to say that she managed to use it to launch a war of words with the governor of the state of Virginia and a couple of other people. Then she compiled all of the letters, published them as a tract that sold 300,000 copies, and gave many white Northerners just before the Civil War began just a cataloging of the arguments she'd been honing her whole life as to why we had to end slavery as soon as possible. So yes, there's a chapter in my book about that, and it is a great story, if I may say so myself.
Thank you. William has a question about Maria Weston Chapman. He's wondering if did Chapman ever give any idea of what she imagined America would become? Did she expect abolition to lead to racial equality? Did she articulate her hope for us today?
I don't think that she thought abolition would lead to racial equality. She was morally so sure of herself and her rectitude that once she came into contact with abolition, she married into an abolitionist family. She did not come herself like Lydia Maria did, okay? She married into a very old Boston abolition family, the Chapmans. So once her moral self-righteousness came into contact with the moral evil of slavery, she turned her life over to ending it because it was immoral. And that's not a terrible thing to say about. I wish that I could have that on my tools. But I think that she was a Bostonian. She believed in the Brahmin hierarchy of value. And so you see in the letters, it oozes out that her Brahmin and his friends really did not think that their Black lecturers were their equals. And I think you have to acknowledge that social change comes at many layers. And the layer of her facing her social standing and all of her money and all of her stunning ability to end slavery was a completely respectable and good thing to do, even if it did not go all the way.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, and that's all we have time for, unfortunately, but this was an excellent conversation. Thank you so much, Linda and Lydia and Dan, for acting as our moderator. You all mentioned the Grimkeys earlier, and we did do an event on Tuesday with Carrie Greenwich, where she talked about her book, and it pairs perfectly with this conversation, and that is up on our YouTube channel. You can check that out. I put the link in the chat, but you can also look up Mark Twain House programs and find it there. This webinar will be up tomorrow when I get it into the office and can upload it onto our YouTube channel. I also want to say a few things about upcoming stuff, upcoming events we have. We'll have a lot of holiday programs coming up in the next 3 weeks, including lots of stuff connected to the Clemens family, and virtually and in person. And also we'll have other author programs as well next week. You can find all links for this all on our website and social media. So thank you so much. Thanks
You
again
to
to
Dan and
Dan.
Omar too. Thank you for
Yeah.
wonderful questions, Dan. That was so thoughtful and just great fun. Thank you.
I've done a lot of these talks and you were terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.